Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's so great to see such a big crowd here today. I first want to mention we have two new members today. One is August Robežnieks, who isn't here today, and the other one is Eric Albrechtssons, who just casually happened to be passing the Latvian Center office last week. Marek gave him our information, and now he's here today. And he is from Montreal originally, and then Newfoundland, and hasn't really been in the Latvian community for like 50 years. So welcome, Eric. There he is. So special thank you for being here again for another First Thursday program and Chef Ingo's lunch. I just want to remind everybody that if you did not receive this in your email inbox last Friday, the news comes out every Friday. Please either contact me or send me an email at mara@latvianseniors.org, and I will add you to the list. So First Thursdays. We started First Thursdays in September 2024, and I counted this morning, and since then we've had 1,600 people, over 1,600, attending the English language programs. We had a couple of good turnouts in the beginning, like 101, 114, but now we've been up to like 124, 126, and 134. So please keep telling people about the First Thursdays, and we can really get in everybody who can't understand Latvian, which is what we need. And now for today. So how did today come about? Last spring, Filmmaker Māra Pelēcis and cinematographer Emīls Purvs visited TLPA while filming Trimda 75, Trimda 75, a documentary project about 75 years of diaspora life across 9 North American cities. Māra says that Latvian centers across North America are all facing similar questions: shrinking communities, changing identities, and the challenge of what comes next. She says, how do we preserve this, and for how long will it even be possible? For Latvians, these questions are especially urgent right now. The New York Latvian newspaper Līdz is closing after decades. Austrumu draudze recently held its final service. There are ongoing questions about Kristus dārzs and Saulaina, and even about the Latvian Center where we're sitting right now. So Imants Purvs, who helped bring Māra here from Minneapolis, likes connecting people and supporting meaningful projects, like Trimda 75. So we're very grateful to Imants for his conviction and generosity. And as Imants has said when we talked, we as a community need to figure out where we're going. So Māra is here, Māra Pelēcis is here today from Minneapolis to take us on her creative journey, her documentary experience that has gotten her to the Trimda 75 project. So that we'll be seeing that in a few minutes. And just one final challenge, as Ivars mentioned, there's going to be a province-wide emergency alert test at 1:55. So usually I'm keeping track of time, but today I think the responsibility falls on everybody. So, and now Anders, please.
Māra Pelēcis. Māra Pelēcis was born in the USA of Latvian immigrants. She studied in the US and Germany, receiving her BA in Studio Art and Media Studies from St. Olaf College in 1994. In the 1990s, she spent quite a bit of time between the US and Latvia, and for a short time she even worked as a cultural news correspondent in Riga while conducting research on Latvian contemporary art. For over 15 years, Māra has also exhibited her photography and installation work in Minneapolis, Chicago, and in Riga. She has received numerous grants and fellowships for her work in both art and film, including the Jerome Emerging Artists Grant, 1996, a Fulbright Fellowship, 2000 with an extension 2001, the Latvian Ministry of Culture Fellowship in 2002, Latvian Capital Culture Fellowship and Grant 2002 and 3, Minnesota State Arts Board Grant 2004, and Jerome Media Arts Grant 2005. A lot of grants. Upon completing her MFA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2000, Māra relocated to Riga to work on her documentary feature, Starp Latviām, Between Latvias. And in 2010, she completed her documentary film, Souvenirs, Healing After War. In addition to working with college students teaching film, directing, and production, Māra has also worked with young people in summer camps. She also joined the Kursa community in the summer of 2022. As a Minnesota Latvian, she was on the organizing committee of the 15th ASV Song and Dance Festival, and continues her involvement with the Latvian Association of Organizations in Minnesota, as well as the Minneapolis-St. Paul Latvian School. So, Māra, you're on.
Labdien, hello. Thank you to TLPA for inviting me to be here today, and for everyone who lent a hand to make this happen today. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to share both about my current project, Trimda 75, and as I realized putting this together, the past few decades of work that led up to it. And as it was mentioned, I was here just a year ago this week, actually, which was a complete coincidence. So we were here filming for about a week, and the main question that kind of we're looking at is "Kam tas viss ir vajadzīgs?" And that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It means, why are we doing this? Who needs it? I think the answer is that we still need it. And we heard from very many people of various generations the ways that we are looking at preserving the culture that we have built up until today, and also looking at who laid that groundwork so that we can preserve the last 75 years. Toronto was actually our last stop, and in many ways also felt like the culmination of the story as a whole. Partly, I think, because this is the largest Latvian center in North America. Over the course of several months, we filmed in 9 cities, recorded more than 150 long-form interviews, not including the shorter ones. We gathered stories from earlier days, and as I said, looking forward. Oops. So yes, today I'll be talking about that, but let's go back a little bit in time and kind of what started it all. There's an old saying, write what you know. Corey often reminds me of this. My grandfather was a writer, though he always said, "Es neesmu rakstnieks, esmu tikai zemnieks." I'm not a writer, I'm just a farmer. While he wrote poetry and satire back in Latvia under the name Malinieš Lauskis, which even landed him in the county jail for criticizing the Latvian government in the 1930s. He also wrote for the widely distributed Latvian cultural periodical Tilts, published by Hugos Krastinš in Minneapolis. It was my grandmother, Olga Pelēcis, or Oma, who actually encouraged him to write about life back in Latvia. Some of you may be familiar with the Malinieš Pasal series. It's a little obscure, but it's a history of that very local, of a very specific time that by the time he was writing it, essentially didn't exist. And when I visited them, I would hear these stories. And every week, we went on Sunday, sat over a Latvian hot dish with wild rice, with mushrooms, and I also had to listen to letters from Latvia, sometimes for a couple of hours, from relatives and other writers that they corresponded with. Looking back now, I realize that through these Sundays over the kitchen table, listening to others' stories, that became instilled as a value, that people's stories, memories, and experiences need to be shared and saved. Both my sister and I were given small Kodak 110 cameras by the time we were 4, without any guidance. We were allowed to just go around and take a lot of photographs. By the time I was in high school, or actually 4th grade, I was developing black and white photos, and then in high school we set up a darkroom at home. So that's kind of how I began more the storytelling aspect. I actually didn't really like writing. And because of that, in college, because of the background I had in photography already, I gravitated towards sculpture. Like in the first photo, that's actually a bronze casting, there's fiberglass, because those are things that I didn't know about. And the culmination of those, though, were actually very Latvian themed. The series of 8 photographs inlaid in a floor were from everyday life, which include the holiday meal with the neighboring Latvian family. The centerpiece, which was in a larger show in the Twin Cities at the time. If it was actually pretty much a direct citation from my grandfather's farm in Latvia, or my grandmother's farm actually, that had been taken over by plants and everything was just falling apart. So even all that wood was built on top of the existing floor of a warehouse. So what was, I don't know that the general viewer would have seen it as that, but it was called The Return. And then salda dušsu, pods of light rest on fir branches. And that was after a year where I actually lost 4 Latvian elders in our community. That meant a lot to me. And the light would ramp in and out, and there's just a lot of Latvian references there. So, as mentioned, I went to Minstead, and then after that, being back in a small town in Minnesota for college, it was a bit of a challenge. So when I graduated, I was ready to go back to Latvia. I wanted to see, in the mid-90s, if I can live and work there. I think a lot of people my age were doing that at the time, and I thought I'd give it a shot. So while I did go to meet up with other artists and see what was happening, because back then the internet wasn't what it is today, one day I found myself on a street corner where RBS TV, the first privately run television station in Latvia after LTV, they had an open mic at the Laimas Pulkstens, the clock, which is kind of a central meeting location. And I decided you'd see them every night because they did this every day. And I went up to them after one night and just to ask them, what's it like to go from state-run media to privately owned? I was just really interested because I had done media studies. And the next thing I know, the correspondent, whom I didn't know at the time, was Datsa invited me to the studio. So as many a good Latvian from abroad, I was asked to translate by the end of the tour. Do you want to come and work and translate news on the wire? And I did that for about a week, but translating to Latvian, as some of you may know, isn't the same as for us translating from Latvian to English. So within the first week there, they asked if I wanted to produce a news story about the opera festival in Rundal. And of course I did. That sounded like an amazing opportunity. So the first piece went well, and the next thing I knew, I was cultural correspondent for RBS TV. So the things that happened magically in the 90s. And the more stories I covered, the more I found myself less interested in creating sculptural work. I still did so for a few years, but while I was there that summer, another artist had offered me access to their studio, but I found myself always having something else to do, either going around and exploring or talking with someone. It just seemed like everything around me was really engaging, and I didn't want to go sit in a studio by myself. And at the end of the day, I remember thinking, what could I create that is as interesting as what is around me right now? And that really, it's something I think about now and again, especially when it comes to fabrication. I also realized there was greater access with a press pass. Sorry, I'm not used to these. When a friend and I couldn't afford to see John Schofield, who was in town, we thought, what if we could interview him? So we got press passes to go interview John Schofield. We got to see the show. We got to record the show for the news, and we had a really nice conversation afterwards. And the next day, we were running around to get the next story shot, edited and posted. Boom, boom, boom. But I wanted the work to feel more like sitting at my grandparents' kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, as it was the night before, sitting with John Schofield, just listening and letting time pass and letting the stories unfold. So, so there are different types of interviews. If you're creating television news, there's obviously that pace, and then there's also the slower pace. And then interviews over time, I found allow people to remember and reflect. Sometimes they wander in their thoughts, and often they say things that may not seem important immediately. especially to them, especially to those of us who are living this experience. And very often I hear, why do you need to record that? That's not anything. But you keep the camera on and you tell them it's important, because 20 years later, 50 years later, those stories won't be remembered anymore necessarily. So documentary filmmaking slowly became the space where I can integrate both the very concrete information of a subject as well as people's emotional truths with a sense of discovery over time, somewhere between an expository form, a journey, and a participatory documentary. And Latvian, which actually did screen here sometime, I think in 2003, if anyone happened to be here, was my first feature-length documentary project. And it started a few years after my time at RBS during my graduate studies. The interviews started with one question, and only one question: what does it mean to be Latvian? And the conversations would go from there. There were no other scripted questions ahead of time, which of course was a bit perplexing to those who were used to being interviewed. And in fact, while I was in Latvia at the same time as Christine Gutmann, and we hung out a lot, I went the official route to get the interview with President Vaidvīķa Freiberga at the time. And so her press office calls me and says, "What other questions are there?" And I said, "There are none. We're just going to take the conversation from there." But I think for a head of state, that's a very unusual situation to be in, and I was very grateful that she agreed to this convention of a conversation. During this time, digital video had become very accessible, which also completely changed the way we filmed. Smaller crews were much easier to handle, and in my case, oftentimes I was by myself. For a couple of these, I did have someone else with me, but usually it's a conversation, the camera on a tripod, you hit record, and you kind of watch the time code, make sure things don't go out of focus, take a pause to look at it, sound levels are good. And while the recordings might not be spectacular, they're solid, and they've been the basis for a lot of my work. And I've found that by not having too much around, people really do open up. So, and so along with that, there are two terms that are pretty key to representation theory and ethnographic filmmaking, which are culturally inclusive and culturally collaborative, and they're slightly different. And 20 years ago, people were talking more about just being culturally inclusive, making sure you included everyone in your story, but it's become a lot more important to also be mindful of how you create that story and if it's with the community you're representing. So even with Trimda 75, before I would come to a city or before Emils would go shoot somewhere, we would get in touch with people and ask them, who are some of the people you think we need to interview? And while the answers aren't always the same because everyone's experience is different, there were some through lines that repeated, and we got a better understanding versus just landing on the ground and looking at the website and trying to figure out what's going on. Doing a little more research, spending a little more time is really key. So going back to Latvia and moving there in the year 2000, it actually took me a few months before I even turned on the camera. As I'd begun to understand while I was there that I wasn't understanding some of the layers that went, even though I had lived there for months at a time before. After living there for a few months, then I realized there's a lot that I'm not getting. We speak the same language, but we don't. Lots of nuances. The sentences and the words may somehow mean the same thing, but they don't always. And little unspoken things mean much different things. So it took me a while to really feel like I could approach someone and ask them to share their story. As far as finishing the project, it was a kind of typical post-grad project. I had my conventions. I did a circular narrative. I also didn't include lower thirds in people's titles because I didn't want people to be judged by their status. I wanted them to be heard just for what they were saying, whether they were a farmer or a statesman. And I also didn't have any imagery going over them while they were talking. So the interviews were cut pretty clean, and there's no B-rolls to go to. I really wanted just the experience of seeing that person on screen. So, of course, in projects since then, in order to make the work a little more accessible, I've kind of fallen back to more traditional conventions. And then the question is the interview a discussion or a performance? Because working with people who are very used to being on camera, it can sometimes feel like there's a script already. So once I get beyond the introduction to someone, there are a few factors I like to follow. One I already covered, which is knowledge of the community. When possible, I've spent time with the person ahead of time. This wasn't always possible with Trimda 75, although it's not completely an unfamiliar territory for me, but when I worked with veterans, and I was filming in Washington, D.C., Rolling Thunder bikers, or going into Native American communities to spend time with veterans there, I wasn't filming right away by any means. Whoops. I let people choose the space for their own interview. So for the Garazars film, Eriks Kuore chose to go on a canoe ride. He wanted this interview in a canoe with a single camera that's possible. It was a little tricky. I was a little scared because we're in Dunjazers there, but we were out there for a good half hour, 45 minutes. And it's one of my favorite interviews that I've ever shot because it was just, he was very much being Eriks. So, and of course, even within these frameworks, interviews and oral histories can vary greatly. Some interviews that I've done are shared very linearly. For example, I was invited to interview John Borger, a First Amendment lawyer who had also argued the Supreme Court, and his family wanted his story. And it was very, very linear, which isn't always the case with some of the work I do. Others are conversations that unfold slowly over days, and we'll see an excerpt of Jim Northrup, who's on the right here. For Souvenirs, the film I made about veterans and families, including my own family, because my dad was a Vietnam vet, the key story was to learn from other veterans how to survive the peace. What do you do when you get back? How do you keep going day to day once you've seen everything you've seen? So I had reached out to Anishinaabe writer Jim Northrup, who had written about his experiences, and I was interested in interviewing him, and I think he knew that. But that's not what we started with. I drove up to visit him, and we met a few times before I even turned on the camera. In the meanwhile, we played cribbage, drove out to the tribal casino to buy smokes, and drove to Lake Superior to take in the view. So finally, when he was ready to be interviewed, Jim chose to be by the fire pit, where he also makes his maple syrup in the spring. As a writer, he's one of the vets I interviewed who's very used to talking about his memories because he performs a lot and presents his work a lot. However, something happened while we were doing the interview where that really kind of interrupted that, and he kind of came out of his performance mode. So we will look at that now.
It was on the anniversary of my papa's death that I found the book again, Walking the Res Road. Once I started reading, I just couldn't put it down. There was a story about a vet who just didn't feel right. They were at a powwow, and his sister invited him over. She gave him cornbread, and they just sat and talked. In many ways, she understood his silence. In reading that, I understood that Jim understood not only vets, but also those close to them. I wrote Jim an email, and he wrote back and said I could come and visit. The first thing I noticed was the smell of Folgers and Camel Deadens in the air, just like Opa Ivar's room.
It seems like when you're in a firefight, you can hear better, you can see better, like even your eyes bulge out a little bit. It is exciting. Like your mind is like a tape recorder, and you're recording it all, and then a little bit later, you digest all of the things that you saw. You know, oh yeah, I saw this guy over here, and oh, they were shooting from over there, and you know, you get to rerun the tape.
He had a unique ease about sharing his stories. Just watching him pack his smokes felt comforting.
Oh, for many years, whatever woman I happened to be living with would always be sure to wake me up with a broom rather than come up to shake me awake, because because I would frequently come out of there, out of that sleep and ready to grab somebody or something.
And then, out of nowhere, we heard gunshots.
I could tell right away from the sound that it wasn't very close to us.
Oops, hang on. Oh, there we go. So film projects really only begin with the first screenings. And while Souvenirs had premiered in the Czech Republic and played a few festivals, our focus really became community screenings, bringing it to churches or colleges where we could really have people watch and be in the same room with them and spend time with them. And sometimes they became listening sessions because the people in attendance, they weren't vets, they were family members, kids, wives who had lost their husbands to alcoholism 10, 15, 20 years before. And those listening sessions became longer than the screenings. The film was about an hour and a half, and sometimes we'd be there 2 hours. And that actually became a lot for me because I'm not a trained counselor. And so I started thinking about, I had the chance to work on this film for a few years and process my grief, but what can I give others to process their grief? And so the 80/30 project emerged, and I worked on this for a few years as a community open call, or a community engagement project. And it was an open call for people to take a photograph of 22 everyday objects, which represented the 22 veterans lost to suicide each day in the United States. And so there were a few exhibits of this. Some of them were smaller, some of them were bigger. It culminated at the Hennepin County Government Center, which is a larger space. And we put up all that had been sent in at that time. And then, after doing this for a few years, this also was a very difficult subject. And so I felt like the culmination at the Government Center was a really good way to kind of close the door to it and move on to the next thing, because it had been about 10 years that I'd worked with this subject. So then I was going to do something easy, which is, go and make another short series of Latvian musicians all over the place. And that one is called Trimda. And so I think when I initially concepted this, I thought these would be more like podcasts where I have a discussion and I just, put it online and we get to hear the stories of how this music was made this side of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War when we had our own bands forming, whether it was rock bands or more like, I don't know what you'd call Chicago's Pieciś or Trisno Pardogovs in English, but pop music, folk bands. Yeah. So, but that also ended up being a little bit bigger of a project because, for example, when I visited people, they had these amazing archives, boxes of documents, handwritten texts, lots of them, photographs. And here too, when I spent time with Willem Spelmans for a couple days going through his archives, but you don't need that. That's not snow. But thankfully he listened to me and let me go where I was staying at a friend's house, someone I'd graduated with, and she had a scanner, and I was up till like 3 a.m. scanning over 340 items because kadyao tadyao. When else would I have access to all this again? Even if it were donated somewhere, how long would it be before those would be scanned in and archived somehow? So for each person I met, and if I was able to have access to these materials, that became kind of a secondary but very integrated thing. So these are 6 of the, I think 9 or 10 pieces we have up right now. And that's kind of the archive on the right. I have probably enough for 18 or 20. But at this point, I did edit a great deal of them, but now that they are going to, and they were screened and they actually were online for a while, but latviešu.com asked me if I wanted to publish through them. And so, of course, like many good artists, every time I put one out now, I re-edit it a bit, so it's taking a little while. But they're out there. You're welcome to check those out, and I think they're kind of fun. And now, in the last few years, it's really been a lot about museum collaborations. So right around the time Valiant was wrapping up, which I'll get to shortly, I was invited to work with the American Latvian Association Museum, where they had planned on integrating 5 video pieces as part of their permanent installation when they redesigned the museum. I don't know how many people here have been to Rockville, to Maryland, to the Latvian Center there, but they have a small, I want to say 800 square foot museum. I see you. Sorry, was that a time hand up, or was that a hand up for you've been there? Okay, good. I was looking at my clock thinking, I think I have a little more time. So as part of the exhibit, they actually installed screens, had them professionally installed because they did a special cone speaker so that you could listen to each piece without being disturbed by the piece next to you. And it's really an amazing setup there. And afterwards, 2-3 years later now, they've had the touring one, where those pieces now exist on iPads. And the big question comes up, why are these not just online? Why can't you just put them out there? And part of the reason is rights and archival materials and which rights are paid for. And the other part is that for the voiceovers on the films, we asked Lila Rubbing to do the voiceovers for us, and she was willing to do them in kind, but there's still a lot of rules about the Screen Actors Guild and what is allowed to go where and how far these can go. But just so you guys can see what that ended up being, we will also look at this one.
World War II ravaged Europe for nearly 5 years. When the war ended, nearly 11 million people were stranded across Europe, separated from their homes. They had witnessed air raids, bombed out buildings, violence, and death. More than 170,000 of these stranded people were from Latvia, who were caught in the crossfire between Germany and the Soviet Union. Most Latvian refugees ended up in post-war Germany.
This is the
Some had
previous
escaped
version,
to Sweden,
sorry.
Poland, and other European countries. Some refugees
This
were
is
able
the
to
process.
find work because so many people throughout Europe had been lost in the war. People with no home to return to made their way to one of the 300 displaced persons camps, DP camps, that had been formed in Germany. The camps housed more than 700,000 refugees. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, created the camps. They were under the military authority of the governments of the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. The international relief organizations ensured the refugees' immediate needs, shelter, food, and health care. The camps were plain and bare, but they provided a place to live, donated clothing, and 1 meal a day. There were also stores where residents could use ration coupons to buy basic food and other items. Families were squeezed into small, crowded barracks that they had to share with people they had never met before. At some camps, women and children lived in separate barracks from the men, even if they were family. As grateful as the refugees were for the food and shelter they received at the camps, they craved something more. The chaos of the war left them eager for familiar routines and activities that reminded them of their homes far away. Refugees were mainly placed with people from their own countries and who spoke the same language, making it easier to organize cultural events. Soon after they settled in, schools were organized for children from first grade through high school.
Okay, thank you. I knew that we might be cutting that one short simply because we also have a few more things to get to, and I'm seeing the clock as we are at 25:02. I chose a version that didn't have the score underneath because I was concerned about hearing it in the room, but I didn't realize it was placeholders. So anyway, moving forward, because Valiant, from what I understand, will be screened here in a couple of weeks. Māra, what is the date for that? 21st. So we will look at the trailer for that. But basically, that was created with the museum Latvians Abroad, with curator Marian Alciam and Dita Gruze, PBS editor living in the States. And it took roughly 5 years from development through completion for one feature that ended up being 75 minutes long. The film blends expository documentary with verite, meaning that while inspired by the museum's interview collection and the compilation Net Net Soviet, much of the story also unfolded through production. I made several trips to New Jersey to visit with Juris, and over the course of 4 years, following him through daily life. From the farmer's market to conversations in the kitchen to the Latvian shipping warehouse space he rented, and then even on the Penske truck collecting shipments bound for Latvia. So, and one of the key film's interviews happened by chance in the Catskill Mountains, actually. Well, my kids were at camp there. Juris also has a cabin there. And he happened to be there for a very short time. This was before we had any money, before anything started. Mariana had just called me and asked me if I wanted to join the museum and help with this project. And he only had a half hour before a volleyball tournament at Ruota in the Catskills. But his spontaneous early morning, throwing on the baseball cap, I gotta get out the door, let's just do this so you have a spec interview, which I thought would just be used for the trying to, get funding for the other interviews. We ended up using that interview as a key interview for many of the chapters in the film. And so, again, sometimes the most spontaneous things can also work out because Juris was ready to talk, ready to share. So it was very open, yet very succinct, and it worked really well for us throughout the film.
Nevis tikai, ka nezināja Latviju, bet pieņēma, ka viss, kas ir Padomju Savienībā, ir krievi.
Tajā brīdī, kad notika visu kongresu dalībnieku demonstrācija pie Ottavas padomju vēstniecības, mēs tur ierepojām ar Jūru gājiens, vilktam šito te veco vādu.
Un tad pēkšņi kaut kas tur iekšā laužās lauku.
Un ar to piesaistīt uzmanību ne tikai Baltijas valstīm okupācijā, bet konkrētiem disidentiem, politieslodzītiem cilvēktiesību pārkāpumiem.
Ir runa par taisnību un netaisnību laukā pasaulē. Tas ir, kur mums ir jāapliecina, kas mēs esam.
Tā demonstrācija Madridē arī bija viena no, es teiktu, visveiksmīgākām, kas vispār ir bijusi latviešiem. Tas inspirēja darīt kaut ko vairāk nekā staigāt ar plakātiem.
Mūs arestē, es atkal esmu pie sienas, izplēstām kājām, man ķermeni izskata, vai man nav ieroči, un man vienīgā doma galvā ir angliski sakot, there goes law school.
Cerēsim un cīnīsimies, lai būtu Kurzeme, Vidzeme, Latgale mūsu.
Today, 2 million residents of the Baltic states linked hands to protest not only what happened 50 years ago, but to send a message of defiance to Moscow today.
Nezināju, jo, piemēram, mēs skatāmies uz Čehoslovākiju 68. gadā. Viņi centās, viņiem neizdevās. Un tā pati doma, vismaz manā galvā, bija, ka mēs cenšamies, mēs ceram, ka izdosies. Tas noteicošais bija padomju karaspēks un okupācija. Kamēr padomju karaspēks un okupācija notiek, mēs turpināsim demonstrēt.
So coming soon to the space near you. So we are close to the end time here, but I do want to share what I'm working on right now, aside from Trimda 75. Peter Stajevskis, who led the Allo Museum project, he and I are working on a project about the Philadelphia Society of Freelets, which goes back to 19th century Philadelphia. And that received funding from the Bauman's grant through AABS, or the or the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, and they will be having their 30th anniversary conference this end of May, so we'll be down there presenting that. For the Minneapolis Latvians, I have long had a goal to do a longer project, and so while I'm working on this, I thought, it's 75 years. If they're going to give me money, this would probably be the time. So I did get a grant from the Minnesota Historical Society, and they're very specific about what we can ask for. So for that longer piece for Minneapolis, we're in writing and research. It's not necessarily the same. It's not the same thing as what we're doing with Trimda 75, which is more also like where we are today. And of course, right now we've been asked to submit a pilot episode to Latvian TV because they're very interested in this project. And so we'd have to start with the first one, which would be New York. And so that's kind of what we're starting on soon. The one thing I think that has made Trimda 75 especially interesting has been balancing insider and outsider perspectives. So I came into these communities, even in the States and here, with decades of familiarity. I mean, I know someone, almost in each of the places we went, or things are familiar. You kind of understand how the kitchens work, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting was Emils came in encountering these places for the first time. And that combination has been incredibly valuable throughout the process, especially now that we're putting the stories together. But even as we were interviewing, I was able to ask questions that he would not know to ask, and other things which I took for granted, he picked up on and immediately noticed and saw their uniqueness. So this is we have a series of social media videos. I'll show you a couple of those, and then I think we'll go to Q&A.
Kam tas viss ir vajadzīgs? Šodien mūsu namā katrā ziņā nav jautājums, vai tas ir vajadzīgs cilvēkiem. Šeit mums ir labi, ja mums ir visas paudzes šī namā svētdienās.
Labvakar, cienījamie klausītāji! Ir sācies 4140. Čikāgas latviešu radioraidījums.
Atrodamies Dienvidu Fildelfijas pusē. Te stāvam pāri ielai ir Jāņa Sirma māja, kur dibinājās un notika pirmās pārunas Fildelfijas brīvo latviešu biedrībai.
So, kas ir īpaši par Minesotas latviešiem salīdzināt ar citu pilsētām? Pusi no tām ģimenēm ir tādi jaunie braucēji, kas ir no Latvijas, bet otra pusi ir, mēs esam bijuši tie paši cilvēki, kas ir šeit bijuši 75 gadi.
Patiesībā rodas jautājums, vai tas, ka mēs, piemēram, uzcelsim jaunu namu, vai tas piesaistīs vairāk cilvēku? Mēs tam tā neesam noticējuši. Mēs domājam, varbūt vispirms mums ir pašiem šajās pašās telpās jākļūst par centru, kas ir visiem interesants, un tad varbūt ir jārunā tālāk par to.
Tā kā lielo kārtu no mūsu draudzes ir pār par 85 gadiem vecumā, un žēl iet uz beigām. Tā kā mēs esam laimīgi, kad vēl Linkolnā mums ir pašiem savu baznīcu vēl, pašiem sabiedriskās telpas, un mēs dabonam latviešu mācītājus katru mēnešu.
Es nezinu, kā mēs eksistētu bez vietas. Sirdarbien saulaini šeit, viņiem visiem ir tā kā, zinām, veida gaisotne vai kaut kas, jā.
Kad latvieši, kas ir atbraukuši no Latvijas, man ir tāds prieks, ka daudz tie latvieši, kuriem ir bērni, viņi arī ir mieru vest savus bērnus uz latviešu skolu un arī būt par pasniedzējiem, tā kā mūsu latviešu skolas valodas skolotāji un geogrāfijas skolotāji un tā tālāk, kad vienkārši tas līmenis ir tik daudz augstāk.
Right, thank you, and I apologize I didn't have subtitles on that. So real quick question, what's next? What's next is when Emils and I started this, we really went out on a limb. We had no funding. However, within a few weeks, we were able to secure enough to travel to get these interviews recorded. Our goal from the beginning has been to create a 9-part series. And after being in Toronto last year, we're like, it will be 10 because there was that much more to record and document here. So right now we're pitching it as a 10-part series. At this point, the interest in the films has been pretty solid, and we are actually we've been moved forward in the Latvian Foundation, or Latviešu fonds lielo projekt, where, I don't know how to say this in English, for those of you who are members of the Latvian Foundation might see Trimda 75 in the ranks to vote for it. So if this is something that speaks to you, then please vote for it. Otherwise, we do have we are accepting donations from individuals. We actually had a larger fundraising drive online through social media this winter, and that really helped us get going. And we're still looking for grants from organizations and support, because for every finished minute of video, it's 1 day of editing, from sound to color to starting with the storytelling. And no matter how we try to beat this time, it's always that way. It's never less. So we've got an editor, Dita Gruze, who's willing to be on board, and we hope to get started in June. So thank you very much for your time. I don't know if we have time for another video. I think Imants has a few words, but I want to thank you all for coming with me on this show and tell through the decades of storytelling. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them shortly.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'd like to thank Māra Pelēcis for a very informative and inspiring presentation. Liels paldies visām Mārām un Erikam, un it sevišķi jums par iespēju jūs uzrunāt šodien. My name is Imants Purvs. I was born in Toronto and raised in a very energetic Latvian family. I'm a now retired Latvian community worker and have in the past served as the chairman of the Latvian National Federation in Canada, as well as working 14 years as a diplomat in the role of honorary consul for Latvia here in Ontario. Today, I'm here to express my support and actively advance the fantastic opportunity and initiatives that Māra has begun. The preservation in a film format of the past 75 years of Canadian-Latvian activities is not only desirable for scholarly and archival purposes, but will also serve to lay a solid future foundation for the evolving Canadian-Latvian community leadership by sharing the wisdom and lessons learned from those that preceded them. I see the evolution of the project taking place in two phases. The first phase is to secure sufficient funding and support to cover the costs of the technical work to produce an initial documentary film about the Latvian Canadians in the Greater Toronto Area. The second phase is to work with a cross-section of Latvian community members and responsive organizations such as the Latvian National Federation in Canada to help create a team or a network across Canada that will continue to document the past and current activities in a film format. Since everyone's time is critical and we know that we have a special alert coming on at 1:55, let's now turn to the question and answer session in today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Māra and Imants. And I was so excited about giving all the numbers as we started. I forgot to mention that the final First Thursday will be on June 4th with Annika Lucis, whose grandparents are right here, and she'll be talking about food and cultural identity. Okay, so now we're on to Q&A with Māra.
Yeah, I was glad that you mentioned Hugo Krastinch is a hero of mine. I found that he was probably the most productive journalist, editor, book publisher in Latvian society outside of Latvia. I wonder if you could tell me more about him. He was also, interestingly enough, put out a journal called, in English, I guess, The Voyageur. Maybe you're aware of it. And I think it had a tremendous reception throughout the United States. And the journal, by the way, for those who don't know, Tilts, which means bridge, of course, I think you all know that. But it came out once a month, sometimes every 2 months. But if you look at it, the first edition, 1949, and I have the first edition, by the way, and it shows people, refugees, waiting by a boat. The second one came out with somebody working in a gold mine. So it captured the essence and had a lot of pictures and also interviews with so-called famous Latvian literary geniuses like Jānis Jaunsudarbiņš and so forth. Can you tell me more about his life and How did he interact with you people?
Paldies, Jure. We're going to have to move on. Can you answer the...
I can answer this briefly. I have more anecdotal stories about Skrastinj because my dad laid letters for the books and the magazines. My aunt was his assistant. And there's, I did not know him personally, but yes, he was a pillar. He did a lot in our local community, and he really did accomplish a lot for recording what's going on and sharing that worldwide. It was I think the largest distributed magazine. But I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards because I have a few funny anecdotes, including a squirrel that lived freely in his office.
Māra, I just have a quick question. Could you tell us very briefly, because we're running out of time, how Toronto differs in a few words from the other 8
Maybe
cities?
that's my personal bias. Honestly. But I think it differs. When we pulled up, Emil had already been to all these centers, and we parked on the side on a weekday, and we walked up the steps here, and he goes, "This is the center? This belongs to Latvians?" And that's the difference. It was the scope of everything that was accomplished here over the years, and it was always an immense treat to be able to come visit here, even as a high school or a college student, because there was just so much going on. It wasn't just a building open on Saturday night or Sunday.
Thank you. Lilita.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just thinking, because I always thought maybe New York was bigger than Toronto, but that's not true, I guess. So I wondered about these questions of home and whether you think about returning to Latvia. And you've got growing kids, how that changes everything. But I mean, have you thought about returning and staying?
I lived there for 3 years, and after the first 4 to 5, maybe 6 months there, I thought I was staying. I was like, I'm staying, I'm not going back. Part of that is a little bit of European guilt of being in North America, and this is where I belong, and now I can live here, and whatever. Then my dad died. And literally, that night when I found out, there wasn't anyone I felt like calling. I'd lived there for over 2 years, and I realized there was nobody close enough that I really felt like talking to that night. Not that I didn't have friends, but it was just different. And so I felt the need to come back to be with family for a while, and I thought I'd do so for maybe up to a year. But I very much identify as a Minnesota Latvian, and I love a lot of things, irrespective of everything that happened this winter. It's, I see myself as the kids get older, and maybe because I work project-based and I can travel, I see myself maybe moving, I do have a place I can stay when I'm in Latvia. I see myself kind of living in both the way a lot of people do. I cannot see myself living there all the time, though, because all of my family is in the Twin Cities.
Oh. Thank you so much, Māra. Liels
paldies.
Paldies.
Paldies. Un paldies par uzmanību un ka varēju padalīties ar jums. Un paldies par arī visiem, kas oh, sorry, I switched into Latvian. Thank you for everyone who shared their stories last year and let me be here. All right, that's it. We're done.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.